In June 2012, 32-year-old Brandon and 27-year-old Scott Halverson went missing while hiking in the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest in Utah. For a long time, they were presumed dead until September 2013, when the younger brother emerged from the forest alone. He looked like a living shadow and clutched a lock of his brother's hair in his fist with a death grip. You'll find out what really happened in the mountains and what price had to be paid for this return in this video. The events in this story are presented as a narrative interpretation. Some elements have been altered or recreated for storytelling purposes. On June 15, 2012, at 7:30 a.m., a silver SUV pulled out of a suburb of Salt Lake City, Utah. Inside were two men whose lives at that moment seemed like polar opposites, despite their shared blood and upbringing. 32-year-old Brandon Halverson was the epitome of stability and success. As a lead architect at a large firm, he was accustomed to precision, calculations, and responsibility, not only for buildings, but also for his own family. His wife, Sarah, recalled during her account of the events that Brandon never broke his word and always acted according to a clearly defined plan. At home, two young children, aged 3 and 5, were waiting for him. To them, their father was their primary role model. Sitting next to him in the passenger seat was 27-year-old Scott Halverson. Unlike his older brother, Scott was a freelance designer whose life resembled a chaotic mix of projects and fleeting passions. Close friends described him as charming but emotionally unstable, someone who constantly lived in the shadow of Brandon's achievements. This trip to the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest was intended as an attempt to repair the bond between the brothers, which had become noticeably strained in recent years. The final dinner at the home of their mother, Elizabeth Halverson, on June 14, 2012, left the woman feeling uneasy. According to her testimony recorded in the official report, Scott was acting out of character. He barely participated in the conversation, was unusually quiet, and carefully avoided making direct eye contact with Brandon. There was a sense that something unsaid hung between them, a heavy silence that filled the room, Elizabeth recalled during questioning at the sheriff's office. Despite this, Brandon looked cheerful and confident as he described in detail the route to Kings Peak, Utah's highest point, reaching 13,528 feet. The Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest greeted the brothers with its rugged beauty. The route they chose ran through dense coniferous forests, where it was still cool in June, and nighttime temperatures could drop to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This environment required experience and caution. According to weather station data, the weather for the weekend of June 13th to 15th was relatively stable, although there is always a risk of sudden thunderstorms in the mountains. Brandon, as an experienced traveler, had packed a full set of gear, including a tent, sleeping bags, and a 3-day supply of food. Alarm bells started ringing on Sunday, June 17th, when the brothers didn't return home by 9 p.m., as agreed with Sarah. Brandon's wife tried to call both of them, but every attempt went to voicemail. At 11:30 p.m., she contacted the Duchesne County Sheriff's Department. The search operation began at dawn on Monday, June 18, 2012. The first significant discovery was the brothers' car, a dark gray Chevrolet SUV, parked in a lot near the start of the trail to Kings Peak. The car was locked, and no signs of forced entry or mechanical damage were found on the body. Some personal belongings remained in the back seat: Scott's spare jacket, a pair of sunglasses, and a printed topographic map of the area. Brandon always kept a copy of the map in the car in case he lost the original. The fact that the car was still there confirmed that the brothers had indeed set out on the route, but never returned to the starting point. Search teams consisting of 50 volunteers and 3 K-9 units began combing the main trail and the surrounding canyons. The dogs picked up a scent only within a 1-mile radius of the parking lot, but further out, on the rocky terrain, the scent faded. A helicopter, which took off around 2 p.m., scanned the rocky outcrops and ravines, but the dense tree canopy in the area formed an almost continuous cover under which it was impossible to spot a person. On Tuesday, June 19th, 50 yards from the main trail, in thick underbrush, volunteers discovered the only piece of physical evidence. It was Brandon's cell phone. The device was badly damaged, the screen was shattered into tiny pieces, and the casing showed signs of having struck rocks. According to forensic experts, the phone was located in thick underbrush, where it could not have ended up by accident during a fall. It looked as though it had been deliberately thrown with great force or had fallen during a serious altercation. Over the next 10 days, the Kings Peak area became the scene of an intensive but fruitless search. Rangers combed through more than 30 square miles of rugged terrain. All dangerous rocky areas where hikers might have slipped, as well as the beds of seasonal streams, were checked. Nothing. Not a single scrap of clothing, not a trace of a campfire, or any abandoned gear. The eerie silence of the forest seemed to have swallowed the architect and designer without a trace. The investigation had reached a dead end. The police's official version boiled down to an accident on one of the route's difficult sections, or a sudden change in weather that could have disoriented the brothers. However, the absence of bodies and the abandoned, broken phone created an atmosphere of mystery that standard rescue operation logic could not explain. After 5 months, in November 2012, the active search phase was suspended, and the case was reclassified as suspended due to lack of new evidence. For the Halverson family, a long period of frozen grief began. Sarah was left alone with 2 children, trying to explain to them why their father hadn't returned from the mountains. Elizabeth continued to wait every day for a phone call that would break this unbearable uncertainty. They did not yet know that exactly 1 year and 2 months later, the silence surrounding this case would be broken by the appearance of just one of the brothers, who would bring with him more questions than answers. On September 17, 2013, at 11:45 a.m., an incident occurred on a highway near the Soupston Basin area in Utah that effectively brought the Halverson brothers' case out of the deep archives. The driver of an old pickup truck traveling south noticed a man on the shoulder who had staggered out of a dense forest. According to the eyewitness account recorded in the patrol's initial report, the figure looked so unreal that at first the driver mistook it for a mangled mannequin or a large stray animal that had been seriously injured. It was 27-year-old Scott Halverson, who had been officially listed as missing for 15 months. Witnesses described his condition as physical exhaustion bordering on death. The man resembled a living skeleton. His skin was so tightly stretched over his cheekbones that his face appeared devoid of muscle, and his deeply sunken eyes created the eerie effect of empty sockets. A thick, tangled beard, caked with dirt, bits of dry pine needles, and tiny insects covered the lower half of his face. His once high-quality hiking gear, in which he had set out on his trek over a year ago, had turned into filthy rags that clung to his body by a miracle. When a Duchesne County Sheriff's Patrol arrived at the scene, the officers noted the man's complete detachment. Scott did not respond to direct questions, did not react to his own name, and showed no signs of understanding that he was among people. His gaze remained glassy, fixed on a point on the horizon. However, the most chilling detail the officers noted, while still on the roadside, was his right hand. It was clenched into a fist with such force that the knuckles had turned white and his fingernails had dug into his palm. Scott did not unclench his hand either during transport or when the medics tried to insert an IV. At 1:15 p.m., Scott Halverson was transported to the intensive care unit at the Salt Lake. The medical report states that doctors were forced to administer deep sedation to relax his spasmed muscles and pry open the fingers of his right hand. What they found inside prompted the staff to immediately call in detectives. Clutched in Scott's fist was a tuft of dark human hair that had been roughly cut or torn out. Scott himself had light brown hair, which immediately indicated that the hair belonged to someone else. The state's genetic laboratory conducted an urgent analysis, and just 3 days later, the results confirmed the worst fears. The hare's DNA matched perfectly with samples from 32-year-old Brandon Halverson. This discovery was the first concrete evidence of the older brother's fate, yet it raised more questions than it answered. The tuft of hair that Scott had clutched in his fist for 456 days bore witness to the extremely tragic circumstances of their time in the mountains. Hospital staff interviewed by investigators described Scott's behavior as abnormal even for a victim of prolonged captivity. He remained numbly indifferent to the lengthy and painful procedures for treating numerous festering wounds on his legs and back. According to the surgeon's assessment, the nature of these injuries indicated constant movement through dense undergrowth and rocky terrain without proper protection. However, Scott's apathy vanished instantly as soon as doctors attempted to touch his right arm. The report noted that the patient fell into a state of wild panic and animalistic aggression. He tried to bite the nurses, emitted inhuman sounds, and attempted to break free from the bed, despite critical exhaustion and weakness. A psychiatric evaluation diagnosed a severe form of post-traumatic dissociation. Scott could remain in the same position for hours, staring at the wall, as if trying to relive or, conversely, erase the events of the past year forever. Official hospital records documented Scott's extremely severe reaction to the appearance of Sarah, Brandon's wife. On September 21st at 10 a.m., when Sarah first entered the ward, Scott's body convulsed in spasms resembling an epileptic seizure, although he had never had such a medical history. During subsequent visits, he simply turned away toward the window and fell into complete silence, refusing even to eat in her presence. Sarah stated during questioning that Scott looked at her not with pity, but with an expression of deep, paralyzing fear, as if he saw not a person, but a mortal threat before him. Scott communicated with his mother, Elizabeth Halverson, only in short, curt phrases that pertained exclusively to his basic needs. With tears in her eyes, the woman told the detectives that her younger son had become a completely different person. During his 2-week stay in the hospital, Scott never once uttered his older brother's name. Every time Elizabeth tried to ask where Brandon was or what had happened on that June day in 2012, Scott would either begin to rock monotonously, emitting a low hum, or close his eyes, pretending to sleep. Scott Halverson had returned from that very same Uinta-Wasatch Cache forest where all traces of Brandon had vanished a year ago. Yet he brought with him an air of mystery thicker than the fog in the mountain ravines. He looked like a man who had seen something beyond human comprehension, yet the tuft of his brother's hair in his hand was all too real, tangible proof. Law enforcement understood. Scott was the only witness, and only he knew where in this vast forest, spanning over 1 million acres, Brandon had remained, and why Scott had kept his lock of hair as his sole connection to life. The case was no longer a story of an accident. It had turned into a complex investigation where every glance from Scott and every minute of his silence only heightened the tension. The investigators had to figure out what exactly the living shadow who had returned from the Utah mountains was hiding. September 25th, 2013, was the day of Scott Halverson's first official interrogation. The interrogation rooms at the Salt Lake City Police Department were filled with heavy anticipation. The detectives handling the brothers' disappearance case faced a challenge that defied any standard forensic framework. The main question the professionals asked was both utterly logical and merciless. Where had Scott been for all this time? 1 year and 3 months? How could a man without special gear, food supplies, or medicine have survived the harsh winter in the Utah mountains, where temperatures in January typically drop below 10 degrees Fahrenheit and the snowpack reaches several yards deep? During the first hours of the conversation, Scott, whose voice sounded hoarse and barely audible, began to paint a picture reminiscent of a thriller plot. According to the interrogation transcript, he claimed that he and his brother had been abducted by unknown individuals right off a hiking trail. Scott described masked men who acted quickly and in unison. He recalled an underground room, a cold concrete or earthen bunker with no windows, where he allegedly spent long months in complete isolation. According to him, the kidnappers rarely visited him, leaving only a minimal amount of water and food, and the only sound he heard was the hum of ventilation and the distant rustle of the forest. However, when detectives began to compare this testimony with the results of the medical examination, the story of forced confinement began to unravel. The coroner's report clearly states no characteristic marks from shackles, chains, or ropes were found on Scott's body. If the man had indeed been held captive for over 400 days, deep linear scars or specific pigmented spots would have remained on his wrists and ankles. Instead, Scott's skin was covered with numerous small scars from branches and thorny bushes, as well as signs of old frostbite on his toes. This was not the appearance of a prisoner, but of a person who had spent a long time in the wilderness, battling the terrain and the weather. Moreover, physiologists noted the phenomenon of the patient's muscle memory. Despite his overall exhaustion, the development of certain muscle groups in Scott's legs indicated that he had been covering vast distances on foot every day. His body was not atrophied, as is usually the case after a prolonged stay in a confined space. He moved cautiously, with the habit characteristic of forest dwellers of placing his foot so as not to make a sound. The detectives began to suspect that the story about the bunker and the masked men was merely a cover for a completely different, far more terrifying reality. The tension in the interrogation room reached a peak when Detective Miller placed a photograph of Brandon's smashed cell phone, found back in June 2012, in front of Scott. Scott stared at the photo for a long time. His hands began to tremble slightly, and the fingers of his right hand involuntarily clenched into a fist again, as if trying to hold on to that very strand of hair that had long since been seized as evidence. Suddenly he leaned forward and quietly, almost in a whisper, uttered a phrase that made the investigators freeze. He couldn't hold on, it was the very edge. These words rang out like a sudden flash of truth amid endless lies. Yet a second later, Scott fell abruptly silent. His gaze turned frightened, as if he realized he had said too much. He laughed nervously, a sound witnesses described as a dry, cracked cackle, and hastily added that these were merely fragments of his sick imagination. He claimed that these images and hallucinations had haunted him in the absolute darkness of that very dungeon he had spoken of earlier. Scott began insisting that his mind had been damaged by isolation, and that he himself did not know what parts of his memories were true and which were delusions. But for the experienced detectives, this episode proved to be a turning point. The story about the masked men was now viewed not as a description of real events, but as a psychological defense mechanism, or more likely, as a carefully staged performance. The question of Brandon's fate became even more pressing. If there were no kidnappers, then what happened at that very edge that Scott had let slip? And most importantly, why did the younger brother, instead of seeking help after a possible accident, choose the path of a hermit for an entire year, clutching a lock of his deceased brother's hair in his fist? A heavy suspicion hung in the air. Could Scott have been not only a witness to the tragedy, but also its cause? The police began to realize that every square mile of the national forest where Scott had wandered all those months might hold the answer. But at that moment, they had only an exhausted man whose testimony was full of contradictions and a strand of Brandon's hair, genetically confirmed, which stood as a silent accusation in the hands of the man who had returned alive. The investigation entered a new phase where every word Scott spoke was subject to thorough scrutiny, and every scar on his body was to become a map leading to the truth. It was at this moment that the detectives decided to change tactics. They realized that the key to solving the mystery lay not in Scott's words, but in the places where he had spent the past year. Preparations began for a large-scale search of the Soupston Basin area, where Scott had been found. They were looking for what Scott called the bunker, but hoped to find something far more tangible that might expose his lies. Brandon remained silent, but the lock of hair in his brother's hands continued to scream of a danger that the rescuers had failed to see in June 2012. Before we dive into the details of the investigation, subscribe to the channel and like this video. Your comments and engagement help YouTube's algorithms promote this content so that as many people as possible learn the truth about the Halverson brothers' disappearance. During the first 3 weeks of October 2013, the Duchesne County Sheriff's Department investigation team was working at full capacity. The theory involving masked men and the secret detention of Brandon and Scott Halverson became a priority. More than 60 officers involved in the investigation thoroughly checked databases of individuals with kidnapping charges, as well as owners of remote ranches within an 80-mile radius of the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest. However, the results were disappointing. No reports of suspicious vehicles, no surveillance footage from gas stations, and no matches to the descriptions provided by Scott. Detective Miller, analyzing the daily reports, noticed a strange pattern. Despite Scott's claims of an organized group of kidnappers, no tire tracks from SUVs or ATVs were found in the mountains in areas where it would have made sense to transport the captives. Moreover, Forest Service rangers who patrolled the area near Kings Peak stated that in June 2012 they had not recorded any unusual activity. A disheartening sense began to hang in the air that the investigation was heading down the wrong path to the survivor. On October 12, 2013, at 9 a.m., the investigation strategy was radically changed. Investigators decided to abandon the search for hypothetical perpetrators and focus on Scott's physical route. Using data on the point where he emerged onto the highway, the police narrowed the search area to 10 square miles around Soupston Basin. A specialized unit was brought in with search dogs trained to detect areas where people had been staying for an extended period. After 2 days of exhausting combing through the dense thickets of Rock Creek Canyon, about 3 miles from the nearest marked trail, one of the volunteers noticed an unnatural break in the branches of an old fir tree. 50 yards deeper into the canyon, where the rocks formed a natural niche, a half-ruined hunting cabin was discovered. The structure was nearly invisible. Its roof, covered with a thick layer of moss and branches, blended into the landscape, and the walls of weathered logs seemed to be part of the forest scenery. The officers, who were the first to enter at 2:30 p.m., documented the scene, which indicated a long-term but primitive habitation. In one corner stood an old cast-iron stove. Next to it, homemade bunks made of dry grass and pieces of canvas. Empty tin cans, manufactured back in the mid-1990s, and the remains of dried roots lay on the floor. Inside, there was a distinct smell of dampness and unwashed human body. The hut did not look like a place for holding prisoners, but rather like the lair of a hermit who had voluntarily isolated himself from the world. The forensic laboratory worked at the site for the next 4 days. The results of the analysis, released on October 17th, marked a turning point in the entire case. Experts found over 30 fingerprints on the cans, the doorknob, and the stove, all of them belonging exclusively to Scott Halverson. Biological traces found on the makeshift bed also matched the younger brother's DNA profile. However, another fact proved crucial. Not a single molecule of Brandon Halverson's DNA was found in the cabin, which measured 20 square yards. Not a single hair, not a single trace on clothing or dishes. For the detectives, this was shocking proof that Scott's story of a joint abduction and a stay in an underground room was a carefully crafted and consistent lie. Brandon had never set foot in that cabin. While Scott was settling into the forest wilderness, living off old supplies, the fate of his older brother remained unknown. But now it was clear. He had disappeared in a completely different place and under completely different circumstances. According to Detective Miller's report, at that moment the investigation came to a clear realization. Scott Halverson was not a victim. He was a man who had been hiding in the woods for 456 days, crafting a legend for his return. Why invent men in masks? Why did he hold a lock of his brother's hair in his hand if his brother had never been in the cabin? These questions demanded immediate answers. On October 19, 2013, at 8 a.m., the Salt Lake City Police Department began preparations for a second, much tougher interrogation. Scott's status had been officially changed from victim to person of interest. The detectives intended to lay out all the facts before him: the absence of Brandon's traces in Rock Creek Canyon, the results of the cabin search, and the inconsistency of his physical condition with the captivity story. They planned to corner him, using the evidence they'd found as leverage to finally extract the truth about where Brandon Halverson actually lay and what exactly had happened at the very edge which Scott had so carelessly let slip earlier. The pressure on the younger brother had reached a breaking point, and law enforcement was certain. This time, his made-up world would not withstand the clash with real forensic science. On October 20, 2013, just a few hours before Scott Halverson's scheduled re-interview, a second team of detectives completed their painstaking analysis of digital media and the family's personal archives. What had initially appeared to be a tragedy of the ideal American family began to rapidly take on the hallmarks of a premeditated drama. Investigators gained access to recovered data from cloud storage and social media servers and conducted a series of confidential interviews with the brothers' inner circle. The results of this investigation permanently shifted the direction of the inquiry. According to the Cybercrime Unit's report, approximately 6 months before the fatal trip, in December 2011, the nature of the communication between Scott and Sarah, Brandon's wife, had changed dramatically. An analysis of deleted messages in messaging apps revealed hundreds of entries indicating a secret romantic relationship. It was a brief but extremely intense and destructive affair. The investigation obtained testimony from a close friend of Sarah's who, on condition of anonymity, confirmed it wasn't just a crush. Scott literally lost his head. He was on the verge of despair because of his guilt toward his brother, but couldn't find the strength to end the relationship. The case files document that Scott repeatedly tried to stop seeing her, but Sarah, according to the witness, had a significant emotional hold over him. In one of the recovered letters, dated April 2012, Scott wrote, "I can't look him in the eye anymore. Every time we meet is a knife in the back for Brandon. We have to stop this before everything falls apart." However, despite these words, the facts told a different story. The secret meetings continued in small hotels on the outskirts of Salt Lake City almost right up until the day of the disappearance. This new information forced the detectives to reevaluate the very nature of the joint trip to the mountains. Now the story about an attempt to restore a brotherly bond and reconciliation looked like a cynical cover-up. A key question arose. Did Brandon Halverson know about the betrayal? The answer was found in the architect's financial records. On June 14, 2012, the day before the silver SUV drove toward the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest, Brandon made a payment of $2,500 to the account of the private detective agency, Silver Knight. Investigators immediately contacted the agency's owner, Mark Evans. During his testimony, Evans confirmed that Brandon Halverson had hired him to follow his wife. "He came to me completely calm, but that calmness was frightening," the detective recalled in the interview transcript. Brandon provided a list of addresses and phone numbers that aroused his suspicion. 3 days before the trip, I handed him a folder with the initial findings, including photos showing Sarah and Scott together at a restaurant in the suburbs. According to the investigation, Brandon received irrefutable evidence of his younger brothers and the mother of his children's infidelity immediately before the start of the reconciliation trip. This discovery turned the mountain trip from a vacation into an act of confrontation. Brandon's psychological profile, compiled by FBI experts, described him as a man of his word and duty who could not tolerate chaos or lies. Now the detectives had reason to believe that it was the older brother who had initiated the trip to such a remote and dangerous area, and his motives might be far from forgiveness. Tension in the sheriff's office had reached a breaking point. Every new fact only underscored how deep the rift between the brothers was. If Brandon knew everything, then what actually happened inside the car during the trip, which lasted over 3 hours? What conversations took place around the campfire on the first night? The detectives realized that the tuft of hair in Scott's hand might now be not evidence of a kidnapping, but a trophy or a symbol of the violence that had taken place at the summit. The brothers' mother, Elizabeth Halverson, recalled a detail she had previously overlooked during a follow-up interview on October 22, 2013. She noted that a few weeks before his disappearance, Brandon had begun actively studying maps of Utah's most inaccessible canyons, including areas where trails were practically non-existent. He said he wanted to find a place where no one would interrupt them while they had a man-to-man talk. She quoted her son as saying, "The investigative team now had a powerful tool for applying pressure. They possessed information about the affair, the private investigator, and the true emotional state of both men." A spectator to this drama, unfolding within the department's walls, witnessed the image of the perfect family crumbling, leaving behind only dirt and suspicion. The investigators were preparing to present these facts to Scott during his interrogation. They planned to show him copies of the private investigator's photos and printouts of his own messages to Sarah. This was the moment of truth. Every member of the investigation team understood. Scott Halverson could no longer hide behind stories about people in masks. He would have to explain how he looked into the eyes of his brother, who knew his dirtiest secret, and why, as a result of that conversation in the woods, one of them vanished forever, while the other returned a living dead man with a clump of hair in his fist. The story of survival in the mountains has finally turned into a story of fatal revenge and unbearable guilt. On October 21, 2013, at 9:30 a.m., a silence reigned in the Salt Lake City Police Department's interrogation room, a silence the investigators themselves later described as deafening. Detective Miller and Detective Henderson laid out on the metal table in front of Scott Halverson the evidence they had gathered over the past few weeks. Taking center stage were 12 high-quality color photographs taken by a private investigator, in which Scott and Sarah were captured in moments that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Next to them lay printouts of the forensic analysis from the abandoned cabin in Rock Creek Canyon, where Scott's DNA had been found everywhere and Brandon's nowhere. According to the audio recording of the interrogation, Scott Halverson did not utter a single word during the first 20 minutes. He looked at the photographs, and his face, according to the detective's observations, gradually lost the last traces of the detached calm he had displayed earlier. When Detective Miller asked directly why Brandon Halverson had hired a private investigator the day before their trip to the mountains, Scott covered his face with his hands. His shoulders began to tremble slightly. The transcript records that at 10:14 a.m., Scott asked for a glass of water for the first time and barely audibly said, "It all went wrong from the very beginning." Scott Halverson's confession lasted over 3 hours. He began to reconstruct the events of June 16, 2012. According to him, the atmosphere in the car during the drive to Hayden Pass was unbearably tense. Brandon was silent almost the entire time, only occasionally turning the radio up to full volume. Scott claimed he could feel his brother's heavy gaze on him through the rearview mirror, but was afraid to ask what had happened. They left the car at the trailhead and began the ascent of one of the unnamed peaks located at an elevation of approximately 10,200 feet above sea level. According to Scott's testimony, when they reached the rocky ridge, which offered a view of a deep canyon, Brandon suddenly stopped. He didn't take off his backpack. he slowly pulled a paper envelope from the inner pocket of his jacket and tossed it at Scott's feet. Inside were the very same photographs that now lay on the interrogation table. Scott recalled that at that moment, time seemed to stand still. Brandon began to scream. These were not just words of insult, but an outburst of rage from a man whose world had been destroyed by those closest to him. "He said I took everything he had from him," Scott quoted his brother as saying during the interrogation. The conflict quickly turned physical. Brandon, who was taller and physically stronger, overcome by uncontrollable rage, lunged at his younger brother. They were standing at the very edge of a rocky ledge where the ground consisted of loose shale and small stones. Scott claimed that he was only trying to shield himself from the blows with his arms. During another attempt to strike Scott, Brandon, in a state of rage, misjudged his strength and lost his footing. His right foot slipped on the loose ground. "I saw his eyes for just a second," Scott told the detectives, and genuine horror was evident in his voice. He was trying to grab at the air, but there was nothing there, just emptiness. Brandon's body vanished over the edge of the canyon in an instant. Scott described his state at that moment as complete paralysis of will. His heart was pounding so hard that he couldn't hear his own scream, which tore through the silence of the high mountains. He stood at the edge of the cliff for about 10 minutes, looking down where, 300 yards deep in the crevice, there was no sign of movement. Scott began his descent down the treacherous slope, risking his own life. It took him over an hour. When he finally reached the bottom of the canyon, he found Brandon among the jagged rocks. His older brother was dead. The injuries sustained from falling such a distance left no chance of survival. At that moment, according to Scott, he suffered a complete psychological breakdown. Looking at the mangled body of the man he had betrayed and who had died because of his actions, Scott realized his new reality. Instead of grabbing the satellite phone or returning to the car to call for help, Scott began to see his own death in every action he might take. He was convinced that because of the motive, his secret relationship with Sarah, and the fact that Brandon had found out about it, the police would never believe it was an accident. A clear and terrifying logic took shape in his mind. If he returned alone, he would be immediately arrested for first-degree murder. Fear of justice and unbearable guilt over his betrayal blended into a single paralyzing cocktail. Detectives noted that Scott described those first hours after his brother's death as being in a thick fog. He couldn't leave the body, but he couldn't go to people either. He sat down next to Brandon and spent the whole night that way, listening to the sounds of the night forest. It was then that he realized his life in Salt Lake City had ended right there at the edge of the canyon. He found himself trapped in a trap of his own making, and escaping it seemed impossible without completely renouncing his own identity. This part of the interrogation was key to understanding why a young man with a promising future had chosen the path of the shadows. Scott Halverson was not a professional criminal, but he had become a victim of his own cowardice and moral collapse. He had decided to disappear, hoping that the forest and the mountains would hide his guilt forever. But he did not yet know that the true test of his mind would begin precisely when he decided to remain alone with his secret among the cold cliffs of Utah. The deadly altitude took Brandon, but it also killed the man Scott had been before that expedition, leaving in his place only a shell driven by a primal fear of exposure. Following Brandon Halverson's fatal fall on June 16, 2012, his younger brother Scott made a decision that permanently cut him off from civilized society. According to the psychological reconstruction conducted by experts after his arrest, Scott did not return to the silver SUV left in the parking lot at the trailhead. Instead of seeking help, he began wandering through the woods, trying to find an excuse for his own cowardice or a way to disappear from the radar of justice forever. His route was chaotic. He avoided marked trails, moving only through the dense thickets and rocky gorges of Rock Creek Canyon. About 5 days after the tragedy, Scott stumbled upon an abandoned hunting cabin, which forensic experts later described as a ghost cabin. It was an old wooden structure built back in the late 1990s. It was not marked on modern topographic maps and was so well hidden deep within the canyon that even aerial thermal imaging scans during the initial search operations failed to detect it. Inside the cabin, Scott found old supplies of firewood and hermetically sealed cans of food, the expiration dates of which had passed more than 10 years ago. However, for a man who was terrified of being accused of murder, motivated by betrayal, this place became his only refuge. Scott Halverson spent the entire fall of 2012 and the harsh winter of 2013 in this isolation. According to detectives who examined his shelter, the man subsisted on leftover canned food, but mostly survived by gathering roots, pine needles, and wild berries. His body gradually adapted to the constant cold and calorie deficit, turning into a skin-covered skeleton. However, the greatest changes occurred in his mind. Scott's mind, caught between unbearable guilt toward his brother and an animalistic fear of prison, began to rapidly unravel. During interrogations, Scott described his regular visits to the site of his brother's death. He returned to Brandon's body, lying in a deep crevice several miles from the hut, with maniacal consistency. He would sit for hours beside the remains of the man who had been his protector throughout his life. In mid-August 2013, during one such visit, when the body had already undergone significant decomposition, Scott performed an act that later became the central mystery of the investigation. Using a sharp stone, he cut off a lock of Brandon's dark hair. According to him, it was the only thing that reminded him of his brother, whom he had both loved and betrayed. This symbolic detail became his link to the reality he himself had destroyed. When the food supplies in the cabin were finally exhausted, and the loneliness became so unbearable that Scott began to hear his dead brother's voice in the sound of the wind, he decided to return to civilization. However, he couldn't just show up out of the blue. Over the past few months in the forest, he had carefully crafted a story designed to shield him from any suspicion. Scott decided to use his status as a victim as a shield. He invented a story about men in masks and a kidnapping, hoping that the sympathy of the community and law enforcement would halt any investigation into Brandon's death. The web of lies was thought out down to the smallest detail. Scott deliberately held his brother's hair in his right hand the entire way to the highway. He planned for the police to find this evidence and conclude that Brandon had also been in the hands of the kidnappers, but unlike Scott, had not survived. The lock of hair was supposed to serve as physical evidence of the older brother's presence in the bunker, which in reality never existed. According to Scott's plan, this lock of hair was supposed to absolve him of any responsibility, turning him into the sole witness to a brutal crime committed by strangers. On September 17, 2013, when he finally stepped out onto the road, Scott Halverson was confident in his act. His exhausted appearance, trembling hands, and clenched fist containing his brother's hair were meant to create the image of a man who had gone through the hell of captivity. He counted on no one suspecting the victim of fabrication, and that his silence and aggression when they tried to pry his hand open would be perceived as the result of severe psychological trauma. But, as noted in the investigation's findings, Scott underestimated the power of modern forensic science and the detective's attention to detail. He failed to consider that his own body, his muscle memory, and the absence of Brandon's DNA in the cabin would become silent witnesses to his deception. His web of lies, which he had been weaving for 456 days in the cold forests of Utah, began to unravel under the weight of the very first facts. The lock of hair that was supposed to be his salvation gradually turned into the primary evidence of his moral and criminal downfall. According to the transcripts, Scott frequently paused during questioning, staring at his own hands as if he could still feel his brother's warm hair there. He claimed that every minute in the cabin was a life sentence in his own memory, but his fear of real justice proved stronger than his need for repentance. The legend of the kidnappers was his last line of defense, which, in the end, proved to be nothing more than a fragile facade concealing the horrific truth about that fateful day at the edge of the canyon. The tension in the interrogation room reached a point where Scott could no longer maintain his story, and the next step was simply to reveal the location where he had left Brandon forever. On October 24, 2013, at 6 o'clock in the morning, a convoy of 5 vehicles from the Sheriff's Department and a specialized rescue team set off toward Hayden Pass. In the lead vehicle, under heavy escort, was Scott Halverson. After a month in the detention center, his face still bore the marks of deep physical exhaustion, and the numerous scars on his arms and neck, sustained during his long wanderings through the forest, had turned a dark crimson. According to the escort report, Scott behaved apathetically, barely responding to the officer's instructions, and only occasionally looked out the window at the snow-capped peaks that had concealed his secret for 456 days. The search operation unfolded on an unnamed cliff 3 miles northwest of the main hiking trail. Scott, whose hands were trembling despite the absence of wind, led the investigators to the very edge of the canyon, where the rocky ground dropped off into a chasm about 250 feet deep. He pointed to a narrow crevice hidden behind a ledge of granite rock. Using climbing gear, the rescuers descended to the bottom of the ravine at 10:15 a.m. There, beneath a layer of large rocks that had clearly been piled up by hand, they discovered human remains in the remnants of a blue hiking jacket. It was Brandon Halverson. The forensic anthropologist's report, released in early November 2013, put the final nail in the coffin of the technical aspects of the investigation. According to the findings of the forensic examination, Brandon's skeleton showed numerous fractures characteristic of a fall from a great height onto a hard surface, shattered pelvic bones, compression fractures of the spine, and massive skull trauma. Importantly, no marks were found on the body that could indicate a struggle prior to the fall or the use of a weapon. Experts confirmed that death occurred instantly as a result of the impact with the granite ledges. The lock of hair that Scott had clenched so desperately in his fist during his return perfectly matched the DNA profile of the body found. The trial of Scott Halverson began in January 2014 and became one of the most high-profile cases in the state of Utah. The prosecution was forced to admit that there was no direct evidence of intentional murder. However, the prosecution focused on Scott's actions following the tragedy. He was charged with 2 counts: failure to render aid to a person in mortal danger and intentional concealment of a crime by fabricating evidence. During his closing argument, the prosecutor emphasized, Scott Halverson did not physically push his brother, but he killed his memory when he chose lies over the truth and when he left his body to rot in a crevice, trying to save his own reputation. The court's verdict was announced on March 10, 2014. Scott was sentenced to 8 years in prison. However, the prison term was only part of his punishment. The true sentence for the younger brother was complete and irrevocable alienation from everything he had once known. Sarah, Brandon's wife, never once appeared in the courtroom. A month after the verdict, she officially changed her and her children's last names and disappeared from Utah for good, severing all ties with the Halverson family. She could never forgive Scott, not only for his betrayal, but also for that year when he made her believe in the kidnapping while watching her suffer from his hiding place. The hardest blow for Scott was the stance taken by his mother, Elizabeth. The woman who had prayed for the return of both her sons for a year was shattered by the truth. During their last brief visit at the county jail, according to the lawyer's account, she did not utter a single word. She only looked at Scott through the glass, and there was neither anger nor pity in her gaze, only an endless void. Elizabeth never visited her son again. She died of a heart attack 2 years after Scott's conviction, leaving him, the last representative of the Halverson family, in complete solitude. The price of silence proved to be exorbitantly high. Scott Halverson survived in the wild mountains, weathering a fierce winter and starvation, but he could not survive the truth he himself had tried to bury under the rocks in the canyon. Every minute of his free life in the forest had been bought at the price of his brother's honor. His story became an example of how the fear of responsibility can turn a man into a monster faster than any isolation. The official investigation into case number 482 was closed on March 16, 2014. Brandon Halverson was buried at the Salt Lake City Municipal Cemetery with all the honors befitting a successful architect and father. For Scott, however, this story will never end. Former cellmates and prison guards recalled that he spoke to almost no one, spending hours in complete silence, staring at his empty palms. On Scott's last day in solitary confinement before his transfer to a general regime prison, a guard noted a detail that later found its way into the unofficial chronicles of the case. On the gray concrete wall directly opposite the bed, Scott had used a shard of a metal spoon to scratch out a single name: Brandon. The letters were deep and uneven, as if he were trying to carve that name into the very structure of the building. His survival in the woods, which he had so meticulously planned,